What do you do when it seems like your best effort seems to bring no results? What do you do when it seems like both, say, your enemies and your friends, or the ones closest to you, are conspiring to destroy you or at least undermine you? What do you do when trying to attain your goals or even reaching your goals feel less like a goalpost when you're walking toward them and more like an endless mountain with no summit? I think a story of a legendary general, some horsehair, and some foolhardy tribesmen has a principle encapsulated inside of it that is very much applicable to people in the circumstances that I've described. And it's a fun story, so I think you'll like it. Before I jump fully into this story, I want you to picture this scene. You're a Roman cavalry officer in southern France in 105 BC. You're in a very precarious position because your army's being completely crushed by a horde of barbarians. You're in a position where most of your friends are dead, you've lost your horse, and your back is to a big river, and your enemies are right in front of you. You can feel the blood trickling down your armor. You can feel the water of the river lapping at your ankles. And all you have in this scenario is two choices: fight and die like a warrior, or try and take an impossible swim. The water is way too deep to wade, and it's over 350 meters wide. What would you do in that situation? This is how the main character in our story, Quintus Sertorius, walked onto the scene of history. Now, to get some context of how he got into this situation, I'm going to speed run a little bit through his early life so you can get some decent context. Sertorius was born about 20 years earlier from this situation. We don't know exactly when, but he was born to, you could say, country nobility. His father died earlier in his life, and he was raised primarily by his mother, who, from all intents and purposes, gave him an excellent education, at least for a Roman, which included, the typical fighting, horseback riding, poetry, oratory, um, Greek, stuff like that. He did a great job. She did a great job, and as far as we can tell, Sertorius was really attached, I would say in a healthy way, to his mom, and for good reason. And he got into the position as a young man to kind of decide whether or not he wanted to continue to be kind of country nobility, right? Or if he wanted to end up going for the big leagues. Long story short, he heads off to Rome as, I would say, a older teenager. Finds out that politics is not exactly his forte, if you will, and ends up getting into a position where he just joins the military. And there was a lot of need for that at the time due to the fact that this tribal group called the Cimbri was destroying and threatening the northern frontier of Rome at the time, which was basically southern France and northern Italy. He gets deployed out there, and as his first introduction to both Roman politics and military politics, um, the general, there was two generals. One was already at the field, and the other one was a current consul, which was their version of a president who would also lead armies in the field. He had just got one of those guys had just gotten elected as consul. One was a ex-consul, if you will. They called them proconsuls. and they both had the ability to command men in the field. Problem was that there was already some infighting between the two due to the fact that one was what the Romans called a novus homo, which means a new man. No one in his family had ever become a consul before. He was the first one in his family line to do that, right? So he gets into this position where Sertorius is following one of these generals, and one general is going, "Oh, you're a novus homo. I come from a long line of blah 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 blah." You know this. You can fill in the blank story. And he refuses to work under this dude. In long story short, both generals refuse to work with each other, and they just kind of have separate camps and decide to work um, alone. And the Cimbri take advantage of that. They crush one army and then the other. Unfortunately, that's Sertorius's first experience of a major battle. And he gets into this situation where he's at his wit's end, if you will, at the banks of the Rhone River. Again, about 350 meters of river behind him, thousands of enemies in front of him, and he has a choice to make. Does he decide to run? Does he decide to make a last stand? How would he handle it? Well, he decides to run, but he decides to run on his own terms. He carries his shield, he puts his sword back in his scabbard, keeps his armor on, and just jumps in. The biggest thing about that was that he was doing it as a tactical retreat, at least for him, I suppose. I think they probably had a similar idea about like the Spartans, right? Either you come back on the shield being carried dead, or you carry the shield back home. Similar kind of ethos, I suppose. And he took that to heart, and he swam across that river by himself at about 70 pounds of armor and shield. So not too bad for a little country boy from the Sabine area. And it kind of gives you a taste of who he was as a person. He was a physically intimidating figure. I don't know how tall he was, no one really does, but no one can say that he was a pushover physically. Well, the Romans get completely crushed. The Cimbri, instead of going down through the rest of France into northern Italy and down the boot, as they say, toward Rome, decide to go into Spain, I believe, which was very lucky for the Romans of the time, because if they had, I don't know, we probably wouldn't even know this story. Rome would have probably not existed as we know it today. Point is, Sertorius, since he already had experience in this northern frontier, he was tasked with basically being a spy in the Celtic tribal areas in southern France and wherever else he needed to be. The main point of it was that if he could embed himself enough in the local population, if the Cimbri decided to attack, he would have word of it way before any Roman outpost would. And he did that for, I believe, a few years. And you can, I mean, you could fill in a pretty cool movie just this section of his life alone. Can you imagine just like not being able to speak the language, or if you do, very haltingly, you have to change your clothes, maybe dye your hair, and you're walking through these different tribal areas and you're like, yeah, where are you from? What was your name again? I can only imagine how that always had that little bit of a fearful tingle in the back of his spine, wondering if someone's going to stab him every 2 seconds. Probably happened for years. But he did well, and he did his job, at least enough so that he survived and was able to come back and let them know when the Cimbri decided to come back. On his way back, he runs into this new general who Rome had tasked to defend the northern frontier. And this guy was named Marius. And he had already had a ton of military experience under his belt. He came from a similar, you could say, background, or at least a similar upbringing as Sertorius, being from the equestrian class. He wasn't part of the senatorial class, if you will. kind of an outsider, but extremely efficient. And Sartorius hit it off with him. I think they both respected each other, and Marius particularly enjoyed how Sartorius just always kept things running smoothly. The impression I got of Sartorius was that he was the kind of soldier that armies are built on. He is the kind of he's kind of the kind of manager or leader that companies are just dying to have, because they, whenever you get, whenever you go to his section or his regiment or whatever you want to call it, he's going to be have everything squared away and be on top of it the best he can. Anyway, so the Cimbri come back. Marius, and we don't really get to see too much of what happened to Sartorius at this point. It gets a little bit foggy, but he's attached to either Marius's army or another general's. But long story short, Marius and this other general basically worked together and destroyed the Cimbri force. And I believe it was a force of probably 100,000 mixed different tribes, whether they were Celtic or Germanic. Not a small force. Anyway, the battle ends, and Sartorius is then sent over to Spain, where he makes a name for himself in this one specific scenario, which happened in the city of Castello. This is in modern day Spain. The Romans called it Hispania. Now, to give you a little bit of background on how the Romans were treating the Spanish tribes at the time, it was not very good. It was awful, to be honest. A lot of people who became a governor or one of the governors in Spain would usually be almost bankrupt by the point that they would get there, due to the fact that they would spend a ton of money to get elected to one of the positions of power in Rome. And then they would serve their term for a year in Rome, and then it was pretty typical for people to become a governor in one of the provinces. And one of the ways that you could recoup the funds that you'd spent on your political campaigns was to start a war, right? Start a war and get a lot of loot and basically build your estate back up. And Julius Caesar did it. Countless other ones did, and they would just make these stupid, they would put one tribe against another, or take sides on with one tribe or another. They would start a war for no reason, ask for some sort of outlandishly stupid thing to get the local population upset and ready to fight, and then they would crush them and then get money out of it. The thing is that the Spaniards were very tough. There was a huge conglomeration of different tribes. You have in the central, like, plateau area of Spain, where the mountains were, you have kind of like the Celt-Iberians. They're like Celtic origins, who had taken away from some of the originals who were still on the coast, like the Lusitanians, which was on the Atlantic coast, and a lot of different ones. But these were tough, hardy people, used to fighting on horseback, used to fighting skirmishing battles, and then withdrawing. It was a province that no one could fully pacify, and that's part of the reason why some people liked the idea of being a governor there, because guess what? They would fight back. Long story short, Sartorius is assigned this small command at this city. And unfortunately, the Romans were employing the same tactic the British did here in the United States, where they were billeting or housing soldiers in not just cities, but in personal homes. And in the process of doing that, you can just kind of fill in the blank. They might take advantage of the women there. They might be getting drunk, which they were in this scenario. They were getting drunk a lot and taking advantage of their hosts, and, just keeping a sword basically to the throat of everybody in the town, and everybody was pretty much done with it. So Castello reaches out to another city, and they basically work out a deal that the other city is going to come in and bring in soldiers that are going to be in disguise, if you will, come in right when the Romans are drunk and attack them. And we're not really sure when Sertorius got involved in this scenario. From what I can understand, Sertorius was not the kind of guy that would allow this type of abuse to happen for no reason. And he had a pretty decent moral compass, at least for a Roman. So he must have just arrived and was just starting to bang heads together to make sure that things were done right. But either way, the damage had been done and retribution was on hand. Him and his soldiers get attacked in the middle of the night. He's one of the few that is actually sane and sober at the time. And he gets into a position where he's able to muster up enough of his soldiers and escape out one of the gates and kind of regroup. Now, the Spaniards had made the mistake of going in thinking they were going to just slaughter everybody, which they probably did take a good amount out, but they didn't close the gates after they came into the city. And Sertorius was able to go back into the city with a more sober contingent of men and retake it. Killed every male in the population as far as I know, and then basically resubdued the city. So he's sitting there going, okay, well, at least I didn't lose my command. What now? He decides to take a risk, but possibly get a lot of reward for it. He finds out where those soldiers from the other city had come from, tells his men to dress in their clothes, and then basically approach that other city in the middle of the night. So they're able to do the classic kind of Trojan horse style attack. Hey, I'm your friend. I'm your friend. They're in your gatehouse, and now you're fighting Romans. And he does the same thing to that city. Kills every male in the city and sells the rest of the population as slaves. Not exactly a chill dude, especially if you crossed him. And it's classic Roman brutality. But that kind of cemented his reputation, if you will, as a young commander and someone who you didn't trifle with. And whether it was with the Spaniards or the Romans themselves. He goes back to Italy at the time, decides to run for politics and take a jab at it. Goes for the lowest rung entry level position, which is the quaestor, as they call it. And as he was in the process of doing that, he runs into a situation where Rome is embroiled in yet another civil war. Basically, the Italians outside of Rome, who had been doing you could say, the brunt of the work when it came to supplying soldiers and finances and food and everything else that you might need for the unending wars that Rome was involved in, were getting tired of the fact that they weren't citizens and were not given the option to, even though they were spilling their blood in Romans' wars. The long and short of it was that the social wars, as they called it, broke out. And it turned into this scenario where Rome was on the back foot. And Sertorius was commissioned to basically go and to create a legion up in north of Italy that could help the mainline Romans, if you will, fight the Italians. And the Italians were really, really good because of the fact that they were in all but name Romans themselves in tactics and how they fought wars. They knew all the tricks that Rome had. And basically, it got to the point that the war ended because Rome finally sat there and said, anybody who joins our side will get citizenship. And the Italians are like, well, then, okay, that's the whole point of us doing that. And so the war ends pretty quickly by them crushing the last little remnant of people who wanted, I guess, revenge on Rome. But it gives you an idea of how stubborn Rome could be when it came to maintaining citizenship, or when they had a hard line, they wouldn't cross it. And you basically had them back against the wall and a knife to their throat before they actually made any concessions. Sertorius did very well in this war. He was leading from the front. He was willing to fight the same way his soldiers were. He was able to live the same life as they were. And whatever he asked them to do, he was willing to do himself. And he lost an eye fighting on the front lines at some point in that war. And he became pretty famous for that. And he was known to say that he appreciated the fact that he had a badge of honor physically on his face at all times, where other people who hadn't gotten scathed in the war had to explain what they had actually done in military service. And he just had it like, yeah, I got that, the social war, right? So he moves on. There's this whole thing. Now, remember this guy named Marius, right? That I had mentioned before. He and Sertorius were relatively close. And you have to understand is like Romans were big on patronage, as you might call it. If you were a higher standing Roman, you would have kind of like this entourage of lower class people or younger men that would kind of follow you around, and you would kind of be there. It, it would. It was like being a mentor, but it was more than that. It was a way to get connection. It was a way of bartering favors back and forth and things like that. And I suspect that's basically what was going on with Marius and Sertorius. The issue with Marius is that as he was going to the end of his career, and he was getting pretty old at this point, he was overstaying his welcome in the limelight of Roman politics, if you will. And he made some bad political decisions of who he associated with and ended up having to leave Rome in disgrace and as basically a pariah. He was sent away in exile. And when the social wars broke out, he came back to help, and they were like, yeah, well, we can take anybody we can, so we'll take you. And so he was back, and this is where Marius and this other general named Sulla, who was one of the, you could say, the senatorial class, kind of the old blood type Romans, started really competing with each other. And that's a whole different story. I'm not getting into it. It is so complicated, and there's a lot of backstory to it. But be that as it may, Marius and Sulla are competing consistently through this time. And Sertorius tries to go into a higher office in politics and gets blocked because of his association with Marius and how Marius interacted with certain situations in politics. And that pretty much cemented Sertorius's position of, I can't stand these senatorial types, and they are very bad for Rome, and they're putting down people that and it was kind of what speaks for itself, right? Sertorius was a solid guy. He was a competent man. So was Marius. But there was always this little thing about, you're not part of the blue bloods, you're not part of the senatorial class, and therefore you're a threat. They're always going to try and push you down. There are some more other things. Again, Marius was not an angel by any stretch of the imagination. He trampled a lot of what you could say very good, or some big mentors he had growing up into his in his career, and he had some natural enemies because of that. But he was popular with the people for a long time. Marius is competing for this, basically the command of a war. Remember, I mentioned this in one of my previous videos, but if you think of Rome less of like a republic, but more like a well-ordered pirate's den, with multiple captains coming in, or a pirate island, if you will, where there's multiple, you kind of maintain a status quo in the place of your origin, but then you go out and pillage and get some money and come back and make everybody happy and rich. And then, whoever is able to do that most effectively is kind of the guy that's pulling the most strings, if you will, right? So the point is, Sulla wants to go and take the fight to a king in what is modern day Turkey, whose name was Mithridates. And there had been this whole attack on Roman provinces, and Sulla was basically tasked by the Senate to take care of the problem. Well, Marius basically circumnavigates that with some political maneuvering, again, that was ill-advised, to basically make it a law that he's the one that's going to lead it, and Sulla needs to come back. And basically, Sulla goes out, comes back to Rome, kills the guy that passed it for Marius, and tells everybody, I'm going, and you better be good while I'm gone. And that's the context that Sertorius is kind of in at this point. Marius is sent away in disgrace again, and Sertorius and the people that are more aligned with him are kind of in this, you could say, power vacuum, because Sulla is back heading to Turkey and Marius is gone. And then this whole scenario happens. Now, you would sit there and think, okay, now this is the end of the story. This is, he figures out that politics is just too much for him. He's tired. He's already fought multiple wars. He's running into his 30s now. He just goes back to his hometown and lives out his life and has a life. Good time there. Unfortunately, no. You're just going to get more politics. But you can kind of see how he's in the middle of this tumultuous time frame. The very fact that he's attached to what you could say his friend Marius is actually kind of messing him up. He's fought with honor for the Roman people, and he keeps getting kind of shafted in one form or another. So this kind of transitions into a point where he meets this guy named Cinna. And Cinna is one of the, he was on the, what you could say, the Populares faction, the more populist faction that was aligned with Marius, while Sulla was more of the Optimate faction. All this had started becoming a relatively big deal during this time, these different factions. But the long and short of it was Sertorius and Cinna try to kind of build their power base back in Rome. And the people that are aligned with Sulla try and kill them. They escape. They basically build an army in the Roman provinces around and show up at Rome's front door going like, okay, are we done? Can we just stop playing this game? And they're sitting there getting ready to take over Rome and kind of pacify the city, if you will. And then Marius shows up with, you could say, a slave army. With just a bunch of ragtag people that he had gathered, and was like, well, I'm here. And Marius was old at this point. He was, I would say, late 60s, or maybe 70. Long story short, it became this awkward conversation between Cinna and Sertorius going, did you invite him? No, I don't know. Did you invite him? Like, why is he here? He's not going to help us. He's kind of a crackpot now. He's not really doing things very well. He's not making good, sound, healthy decisions. But Sertorius finds out that Cinna had invited him, and he just kind of, fine, if you invite him in, we have to stand by our word. That sucks. So they kind of divide power between them, but Marius is a juggernaut, and he has a huge reputation. He's kind of, he's kind of in the stage that Trump is, I guess you could say now, in politics. Just whatever he decides to put his hand to, it happens. And unfortunately, Marius is not doing very well at this point. He's old. He's been exiled multiple times in his life. He's sick and tired of the politics that he's been forced to deal with, the many wars that he's done, and he's starting to hold grudges. And kind of as a grumpy old man that has nothing to lose, he just starts killing people that he's sick and tired of dealing with in Rome. Sertorius does not support it. He is very angry about that. And he even starts curbing, and Cinna starts doing similar things like that. And Sertorius told him to knock it off. But again, you can only control people like Marius to a certain degree. And he got to the point that slave army, or the slave guard that Marius had brought over, was pillaging and ravishing and destroying normal Roman citizens and some of the high nobility as well, but basically taking the law into their own hands. And Sertorius had enough of it and sent his men to take care of them, if you know what I mean. Marius finally dies within a few months of taking power. And you're now in a position where Cinna is kind of like the go-to guy in this scenario. And Sertorius is where they're all kind of looking east and going, when is Sulla going to get back? When is he going to get back? I don't know. Do you know when he's going to get back? And they're all just kind of wondering how the war is going with Mithridates and all that. Well, Sulla finds out what's going on, that I think he even had his house burned in Rome and his wife had to escape. And Sulla finds out that, they had taken over the capital city, and he basically makes a fast peace with Mithridates and starts heading back after a number of years. It took years. It was a weird. That's the weird thing about Rome, kind of as a side note, is that, just across the Mediterranean on a good day, like say from Italy to Africa, it'd probably take 3 days, and like compare it with us, right? It takes us what, a day to get across the world with airplanes. So for Rome, in many ways, if you're going to go from like Spain to say, I don't know, Jerusalem, right? That was actually further for them logistically than us trying to drop troops off in Afghanistan on the other side of the world for the United States, because of the technology we have. So you have to think about it as like, if you're going to send a message out, it's not going to come back. You're not going to get an answer probably for months, especially in those outlying provinces. So for them, this is a world war, if you kind of think about it. So Sulla starts working his way back. Cinna is trying to keep the army together. He's trying to keep the coalition together, if you will. And unfortunately, it was a bunch of spineless senators that were not willing to do the hard thing. And there was a whole lot of different politics associated with that. But Cinna drops the ball, gets killed by his own men because he basically tries to force their hand to risk their lives fighting Sulla, and they don't want anything to do with it. And this was all with Sertorius kind of in the background, just ringing the warning bell, if you will, and going, hey, if we're not decisive, if we don't get some good, if you don't treat your soldiers right, you're going to get in some big trouble. But no one was listening to him. He was still junior compared to a lot of people. And he makes enough of a ruckus for amongst the senatorial class that they basically sent him off to Spain as governor as a privilege, but it was more to just get rid of him and get him out of their hair. So unfortunately, Sertorius is in a position where he thinks, well, if I can make this work in Spain, I at least might be able to create a redoubt or a little pocket of, you could say, Marian aligned Rome here in Spain if everything goes bad, which he believed it was, and he was right. Sulla comes back and he does what Marius did, but to the nth degree, unfortunately. And he set out a bunch of what was called prescriptions, where anybody who had crossed him or his faction was basically hunted down and taken care of. Anybody who helped them or tried to help them was treated the same way, right? And basically, Sertorius was on that list. Well, while Sulla is on his way back, and the senators in Rome are waffling around and being useless, Sertorius is working with the local tribes in Spain and basically saying, hey, all this other stuff, treatment you've been treated before, is not been appropriate. It's not good. And you shouldn't have to deal with the kind of taxes we're trying to levy on you. So he cancels the taxes. It was a very shrewd move on his part because he knew that he better be the better of the two options once Sulla's armies started coming to Spain. And they did. They try and cross the Pyrenees. And Sertorius, the Pyrenees are a line of mountains basically separating Spain from France. And there's a number of passes there, and there's a number of tribes there that would kind of force you to pay a toll if you wanted to go through it. But long story short, Sertorius sends a detachment of soldiers and a lieutenant to basically block the pass. And somehow, some way, whoever's in charge of the, you could say, the pro-Sulla Romans came in and found a way to assassinate that lieutenant and basically destroy the command structure so that they were able to enter Spain. And Sertorius has barely got even like a legion of troops under his command of Romans. So you're dealing with about 5,000 men. And he has a number of aligned tribes that were willing to work with him. And he's realizing that this army's way too big. He can't take them. He doesn't have the roots. He doesn't have the foundation to be able to go after them. So you can only imagine what it was like to make this call, right? Sertorius is, I mean, he's edging into his 40s at this point, right? He's, probably mid 40s, maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but he's up there. He's been fighting for Rome for 20 years at least, right? And he's going, the world as he knew it is just basically crumbling. You can only imagine the long nights at a desk, by putting his hands on his face going, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. And he was right. And he got to the point where he had to sit there and make a call and go, hey, all you local tribesmen, you just need to disappear into the hills. And the Romans that were aligned with him, he just basically loaded up onto some ships and they set sail. Of course, the mainline Romans, as I would like to call them from now this point on, so Sertorius was still Roman, okay? But the mainline Romans from Sulla send ships after him. And it must have been such a brutal, like, gut-wrenching process for all the people involved, because it's like, think about it, like, Sertorius, if he had just had a different mentor, if you will, for whatever reason, if Sulla had been the commander of the army that he had talked to after he had been doing his spying on the Celtic tribes, it would be a very different thing. He'd probably be in Italy right now, or in the East, on the main side, the winning side, right? And I'm sure a lot of the other soldiers that were with him were thinking the same thing. The point is that he's in a place where a lot of people in his position would be unaliving themselves. And I'm sure it kind of crossed his mind. Well, anyway, they crossed the Mediterranean into North Africa, and they try and disembark. This is a classic case of kicking a dead horse. They try and disembark to get water, right? And then the local tribes freak out and attack them, and they lose some men, and they have to hightail it back to their ships. And so they're out there in the Mediterranean going like, geez, we can't even get flipping water at this point. And it's kind of probably the lowest point in Sertorius's life. He's contemplating, like, what was the point of all this stuff that I've done? What's the point of doing anything now? Should I just end it all and let my men figure out a way to surrender to the mainline Romans and get some mercy? Like, what's the point? Well, he sees some ships coming toward him, and I think he probably made his peace with whatever was going to happen. Probably got ready for another fight, maybe end with a streak of glory. But it wasn't the Roman ships that were coming toward him. They were pirates. And he's like, oh, great. Now I'm going to be taken out by pirates. This is wonderful. But the pirates actually were there for him and not to attack him. They wanted to align with him. I think they were Sicilian pirates, if I'm correct. The long and short of it, they were like, hey, we don't like mainline Rome. Sulla's a jerk at this point. So, do you want to align with us and we can attack the mainline Roman ships together? And the story's just like, well, that's a nice change of events. So he tries. They go after him. The pirate ships were not really. They were better at being fast and nimble and not really good at like straight on sea battles. And there was some really bad weather involved. The long and short of it, they lose the battle. Okay, and Romans are not very big on sea warfare anyway. But so they lose the battle, and Sartorius is kind of in this position where he's like, "Geez, like what do I do in this scenario? Like what now?" And in this, the pirates are working with him now. He still has a decent amount of his troops left, and I think he kind of got to the point where he's like, you know what, I'm done with Rome. I'm sick and tired of this drama. And I think a lot of us can. I mean, you can just think about how it must have felt. Like, hey, there's a little bit of hope, and then crush again. And there's a little bit of hope and crush again. And I think he was looking on for a way out, in a way. And he had heard about these islands called the Islands of the Blessed. And from what we can tell, it was probably the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain. There's a bunch of legends about the islands that basically there's just fruit falling off of trees. It's basically paradise, you could and it's not inhabited, all this good stuff. And so I think Sartorius was sitting there seriously contemplating going, hey, why don't we just go there and start a colony and screw Rome, The pirates at this point kind of laugh at him and go, no, we want to do the pirate thing. So they decide to switch sides and go to North Africa and help you could say, a pro-Sullan rebel leader who you could say he had a claim to the throne in the local area and was trying to basically take it and have the support and basically be a client kingdom of the Sullan Romans, if you will. And I think that must have really pissed off Sartorius. I think he sat there and were like, oh, okay, you're going to do that now. So he basically lets them go, follows them, joins in the battle on the side of you could say the people that are in power at the time at that specific kingdom, defeats both the pirates and Aeschylus and the contingent of Romans that are sent to mainline Romans who are sent to help Aeschylus. And it just turns into a situation where finally Sartorius has a toehold, right? He finally has a toehold. And in the process of doing that, he's in a interesting position where he kind of gets to have room to breathe. And from what we can tell, he did a very good job at basically respecting the local authorities there. He didn't try to start a new kingdom by himself. He worked with those people that he had, quote unquote, saved, right, from Aeschylus and his ilk. But the long and short of it, he was just kind of in this place where he's playing kind of a waiting game and just trying to see what's next. There's Plutarch makes an interesting little anecdote about how they find the bones of a giant, and or there's a legend of bones of a giant, and him and his men go over there and unearth it and then find that there's actually bones there. Total myth, but still kind of a fun little story. Around this time, as he's kind of licking his wounds, if you will, some Lusitanians, and these were the tribesmen that were on the Atlantic side of Spain at the time, send a delegation basically saying, hey, lo and behold, surprise, surprise, the Roman governor here sucks. He's terrible. And he's, taxing us into the dirt. He's trying to do our, He's doing the classic Roman governor thing. And we think, and you've treated us fairly before, and you have a reason to treat us better in the future because of the situation you're in, and you're a decent commander. So do you want to join with us and lead us? So they send this envoy to him, and at around the same time, Sertorius gets news that his mom had passed away. And in the process of doing that, we are told that he basically shuts himself up in his tent for 7 days. Just kind of just goes full on hermit mode, or as my generation would say, he went monk mode before there was monks. I think mostly, I mean, you can only just think again. Let's explore what he was feeling at the time. Possibly, he was probably wondering again, like, what was the point of all this? My mom raised me up a certain way, and I've tried to do the best I can. Would she be proud of that? Would she be proud of who I've ended up becoming? Would she be disappointed? You can sit there and just think about him just sitting there on his bed, looking at the ceiling of his tent, wondering, what about this offer from the Lusitanians? How do I make this? How do I make this work? Right? And he probably is wondering too, is like, is it even worth it? I mean, why don't I just like leave, disappear, go to the Canary Isles with a small set of troops by myself and start a colony there and just live out my days in peace? I'm sure he was wondering about all of that. And I think there's something to be said about this stage in his life where I think he appropriately responded. And a lot of people would sit there and say that he was like showing weakness and he's such a mama's boy, blah, blah, blah. And you could argue that, I suppose. But I think there's something to be really said about his ability to acknowledge that something had hurt him and that he needed time to reconnoiter and figure out what was going on in his life and what was the next step. What did he have in him to deal with the next steps in his life, if you will? So after the 7 days, I think he had cleared his head enough, and he decided to take up the Lusitanians' offer and go to Spain. He loads up what's left of his troops, crosses the water. As far as I know, I think there might have been a bit of a sea battle, maybe a small one, but either way, he was able to get into mainline Spain without too much terrible difficulty. Starts working with the Lusitanians consistently, basically working, building a combination of a Roman and Iberian army, if you will. And there's something I need to kind of explain here. Romans, their tactics and their way of fighting was very different compared to a lot of militaries at the time. One of the big ones was that they were very focused on, they would go to the seat of power, they would besiege it and take it over, and then use that as a base of operations to, take care of the rest of the countryside. If they couldn't do that, they would build their own cities, if you will. They'd make forts, even their own camps, right? Every night they would sit there, instead of just pitching tents, they would build a fort. They would be, at least a earth embankment, some ramparts. It was a whole thing, right? And that's part of the reason they were able to defeat the Cimbri back in the day, and so many other Celtic tribes at the time. But the point was that they were very methodical. They were very, when they were fighting, their main emphasis was on heavy infantry, and they would utilize those blocks of infantry to basically stop anything that was thrown at them. It's very cautious, but very steady, if you know what I mean. The Iberians, the Lusitanians, all of these other guys were very, it was a very different way of doing it. And it was partially associated with the tactics that came along with this being in Spain, right? From what I understand, Spain is very rocky, very mountainous, and very uneven terrain. And so having the ability to move fast, move quickly, and it was basically a guerrilla warrior's paradise, which is not a surprise. Where we get the term, I believe, came from the Spanish fighting Napoleon's armies later on in history, and where we get the name guerrilla is from basically a term from Spanish meaning little warrior or little army, kind of the small tactic fighting. So the you know the Iberians, the the Celt-Iberians, the Lusitanians, all were very well versed in this kind of way of fighting, if you will, and they excelled at this process of attacking, destroying baggage trains or supply chains, and then disappearing into the hills. And they're also really accomplished horsemen. And Sertorius had to make a decision. Was he going to try and make them second-rate centurions or, legionaries, or not centurions, but centurions and legionaries, right? He's going to make them into like second-class Roman military units, or is he going to work with you could say, their natural talents of being able to be quick, fast, and cavalry based in many ways. And he decided to lean into that. He brought stability and kind of a discipline to their soldiers, but he also let them fight the best way that they were equipped to. And with the armies that were in Rome, it was the best call. It was basically a cat and mouse game. You only fight if you're on Sertorius' side, you'd sit there and just jab at them, right? You come at them, destroy a baggage train. Okay, well then they learn their lesson. They make sure they're covered in troops. Well, then you attack them with a bigger set of troops to destroy like a whole contingent of the supplies and the guys. And you have to understand too is like supply systems back then were very primitive. Roman legions lived off the land, right? So if you're in a situation, if you're needing grain or if you're needing anything, you have the supplies that you come with. Once those run out, you're now pillaging the landscape to get what you need. And Rome was used to doing that, but Sertorius knew that as well, right? And he used that to his advantage again and again and again. And he basically got whoever's in charge of Spain, the governors of the time, in these positions where they would come after him into the interior of Spain, and either Sertorius or one of his lieutenants would just get them in a position where once they would get so frustrated by these hit and run tactics, you could let's picture it a little bit here. You're a Roman legionary, right? You're in Spain. You hear about this Sertorius guy, right? Okay, we're going to go after him. Well, the classic thing was to go after a city that was aligned with him. Well, some of them were there. There wasn't a lot, and most of the guys that he had with him were mobile. So you go, okay, let's go into the territory that he's in. Let's have a pitched battle and get it over with. But Sertorius's group never lets you do that. Instead, they're destroying every baggage train you have. They're destroying every scavenging party you have. And then when you bunker down in your little fort that you make every night, they're making surprise fake attacks all night, just keeping you awake, keeping you annoyed, and slowly starving you out, destroying all the resources around you, making it so that it's impossible for your army to function, even with like half rations, right? So if you're a Roman legionary or mainline Roman legionary, you're sitting there going, you're hungry, you're exhausted, you've been waking up, you're probably getting 2 hours of sleep at maybe a night. You're tramping all over the freaking mountains in Spain, and you're in a position where you're just wanting to get it over with. And that's how a lot of these commanders would get into trouble, where they would just force the issue. And Sertorius would do a mainline clash on his terms and inevitably destroy them. So he takes over most of Spain. with this tactic. Destroys all the local governors and the armies that were stationed there. Rome gets wind of it, okay? And in the process of doing that, they are now in a place where Sertorius has had time to recover, get some more tribes on his side, and be able to responsibly. And he's basically unified most of Spain under his control. Sulla sends this guy named Metellus with a pretty large army over into Spain. And Sertorius gives him the same treatment, right? The same exact treatment that he got the other ones. And I think there's a fun story in here that kind of encapsulates how Sertorius was able to just out general pretty much anybody he interacted with. There is this one city called Lango. I had to look it up. Lango Briga, that was allied with Sertorius, and Metellus started wising up, right? After playing the cat and mouse game, building forts and making camps and just getting constantly just harassed at all times and losing a good amount of men, but not a lot. He runs into this situation where he's like, okay, well, let me just go after the cities that are supporting Sertorius, or at least they're saying they are. And that kind of forced Sertorius to kind of get into a position where he had to show up. He couldn't play the guerrilla warfare tactic as much, because if he let these cities fall that were allied with him, then all the other cities are going like, well, should we stay with you? I don't know about that. I don't know if we're allowed to. I don't know if this is a good idea, right? And so there's this one city that I mentioned, Lango Briga, where they had a very strategic weakness, right? Where they only had one well, and it was not a very well, it wasn't big enough to supply the rest of the city with water. And the rest of the population depended on natural springs that were right outside the city walls. Still pretty dumb, but it was what it was. Metellus sits there and go, well, this is a low-hanging fruit. Let's go after this guy. And he, starts figuring out what he needs to do. And basically he's like, all I have to do is go over there with at least 5 days worth of water and supplies, and this city's going to break. I mean, as everybody knows, you can only live like 3-ish days without water if you're not doing anything. And he was timing it kind of perfectly that way. And I'll just show up, I'll cut off their water supply, and then they're going to have to capitulate, right? And in the process of doing that, Sertorius, and we don't know much about his spy network, if you will, but it must have been pretty extensive. So he gets wind of it, probably because some, loose-lipped legionaries were at some local, I could say ale house or wine house in some of the local towns that the mainline Romans controlled. But Sertorius gets wind of it, and he goes, all right, well, he says, I need volunteers. And he had been able to get control of a lot of this silver mines that Spain was known for and very famous for. And basically said, I'm going to give a bonus to anybody who signs up to basically carry 2 water skins per man into this city. And I think over 2,000 guys show up willing to do that, and they all just hoof it to this town. Oh, yeah, there's an aerial fight going on with some birds here. That's cool. Yeah, calm down, guys. It's not World War III. But long story short, these guys show up with the extra water. So the city's set up for more than 5 days, right? And then he also has them take all the non-combatants out of the city, right? So the women, children, old, and makes it so that the only people that are going to be drinking water are the people fighting. Well, Metellus shows up, besieges the city, gets into the position where he's like, okay, this is perfect. Well, day 5 rolls by, and they're still not surrendering. So Metellus is in this weird position where he's running out of supplies, and he needs to be able to start scavenging to make this work, right? Well, Sertorius had done his homework, if you will. He doesn't really harass Metellus too much during the 5 days of the siege. And so Metellus sends basically a legion of 5,000 men to go into the countryside and gather resources, right? Well, they gather the resources, they're on their way back, and Sertorius works it so that he has a whole group of men hiding in a ravine that's going to be in their flank. And a lot of these guys are, they're finally getting food. They're after a long march. They're there's a lot of, the back line of the Romans is scattered. The back line of the Romans is scattered, if you will. And Sertorius attacks them with everything, and attacks from 2 sides, and basically completely annihilates this legion. And now you're in a position where Metellus is going, I can't, we have to eat, and I've just lost a bunch of troops, and I haven't lost my whole army, but yeesh. And he has to just pack up and leave and go back into the areas that he controls. So that was probably one of the class acts that Sertorius was able to do in his career. It strengthened his support network with the Spanish. At this point, Sertorius starts getting a lot of tribes willing to defect toward him, and getting a lot of new recruits from especially the interior, who were the Celtiberians at the time. And a lot of them were presumably younger and more, you could say, brash, or even you could say foolhardy, but they had kind of heard of Sertorius's escapades and how well he had done in the previous battle. And I think they were wanting to swell his ranks so they could, deal a knockout blow, if you will, to the mainline Romans. And in the process of doing this, they join his army. He's trying to get in the process of getting them actively involved and training them and getting them up to speed on how they do things in his army. And a number of them were just hell-bent on having a pitched battle with Metellus. And Sertorius, after a while, decided that it might be best they give it a try with some training wheels, if you will. So they try and start a pitched battle with Metellus and start getting crushed promptly, because, as mentioned before, the Romans were very good at this type of war. And Sertorius basically puts a blind eye to it for a little while, long enough for them to start realizing that they're probably not going to survive. And he comes in with a rescue force and gets them out of there before they are completely annihilated. After that, he kind of lets them stew in it a little bit. They kind of lets them percolate in it. They're probably around camp a little glum, nursing wounds, losing companions, and losing even family members in this fight, and having to process what they thought was going to be another flawless victory that didn't turn out as much. But Sertorius lets them sit in that for a bit. So Sertorius gathers them up for a meeting at some point and takes them into a clearing where there's this young horse with a beautiful mane, healthy coat and tail, that has a old man standing right behind it. And there's a old horse, a scraggly, unkempt, and relatively scruffy horse that has a young man behind it. And you can only like imagine what it was like to be one of these Celtiberian tribesmen. I'm like, okay, there's nothing unusual about horses and men, but they're just kind of like lined up in this way. And Sartorius probably had a little bit of a grin on his face. And you can only imagine just kind of saying, like, what is he doing with this? And Sartorius ends up telling the older man to start plucking the hair out of the tail, the younger horse. And the young man is told to start yanking the tail of the old horse, trying to pull out all the hairs out of its tail in one fell swoop. And he was a big, brawny, tough-looking dude, I'm sure. And what transpired, I'm sure, was relatively hilarious. And by the way, I did have to look this up. Where I was thinking, I was like, dude, these guys are probably going to get kicked. And they probably, at least the young men probably did at some point. But people do pluck hair out of horses' tails. You can look it up on YouTube. But you can only imagine how all these like battle-hardened Celti-Iberian tribesmen who are used to horses and used to this kind of situation, and this young man's just pulling on this tail and probably getting kicked and pulled around, and the old man's just sitting there plucking away, right? And I'm sure that people were laughing at the young dude and just kind of cheering on the old man, just trying to figure out what the heck is he doing, but also just kind of seeing a spectacle, right? And the end result ultimately was that the young horse with the immaculate hair ends up with no hair on its tail. And the old horse still has its tail and probably a pretty scuffed up young man behind it. And it's at this point that Sartorius is reported to have said, "You see, friends, that perseverance is more effective than violence." And Plutarch continues to say, "Many things which cannot be mastered when they stand together yield when one masters them little by little. For irresistible is the force of continuity, by virtue of which advancing time subdues captures every power, and time is a kindly ally to all who act as diligent attendants upon opportunity, but a most bitter enemy for all who urge matters on unseasonably." And this is the core of the principle that I think I want you to take from this video. After thinking through this for a while, and I've kind of come away with three principles that kind of flesh out this point that I think Plutarch made. And the three are: when you're in an impossible situation that you can't get out of easily, start plucking. Number two, small consistency over time beats full commitment over a short period of time. And three, we are all going to die, so we might as well make an impact in our lives and those around us. Let me unpack that a little bit with you. With principle one and the plucking thing, again, it kind of applies to what Jocko Willink talks about a lot in his books and his podcasts, is prioritize and execute. You can't just attack something bluntly, if you will. You have to take it apart little by little to find something that needs to be done most immediately, and then just take care of that first thing, and then the next thing, and then the next. And ultimately, you'll find that the problem gets at least mitigated, if not solved. I found this in my own life, where when I was wanting to go out on a run and I wasn't feeling it, just getting dressed to go run and sitting down and tying my shoes usually got me out the door way better than just psyching myself up to go run 4 miles. Say you have financial trouble. Say you have marriage trouble, learning a new job, health scares, health complications. This principle applies over and over again. If you have to cut it into tiny little pieces and start chomping at that, then go ahead. You will get way further than the guy who tries to get it all done in one day or 1 week or 1 month. And that's one of those things that, like, for me, as I've been going through similar situations, I realized that I've had to just kind of separate or partition different parts of my life, whether into 3 basic categories: my physical health, my spiritual health, my mental emotional health, which include basically my nervous system, and started plucking at every one of those the best I could until something improved, so that if one is having a hard time, I'm putting a little more time into it. One's the other, I put more time into that, and ultimately allowing myself the ability to not just sit there and go, well, I'm just going to get healthy tomorrow. The second thought I had out of this is, again, building off of that small consistency over time beats full commitment over a short period of time. That's what leads into that. Now, I want to caveat this, that Sartorius knew that in short bursts, he needed to put everything on the line. But he did it in a way where he gave himself the best chances of winning. And I challenge you in the same respect. It's like, as you're plucking, as you're just picking away at it, geez, once you find the opportunity, grab it with both hands. And Sartorius, despite all of the things that he went through, was a master at that. But I think that you can see that Sartorius had the authority to speak on this in his own life. He had spent 20 years fighting for the vision of Rome that he had. And it kept being taken away from him, not just by his enemies, but even his allies. And to kind of build on that thought process, I think there's a bit of a dichotomy that needs to be discussed here. Yes, you need to be picking away at it the best you can over time. And that's going to train you to be consistent and be ready, like Plutarch says, to be basically be an attendant on opportunity. But like Sartorius, when opportunity came along and he was able to work out what he needed out of a situation, he grabbed it with both hands and then some, and expanded a lot of energy in a short amount of time to make it work if he could. There's a balance there. There is a balance that there's no formula for it. You have to kind of figure it out as you go, but you have to figure out that balance. There's been many times I've lost opportunities in life because I went too hard, too fast, and too intense on something or another. And I burnt myself out and lost opportunities when they came along. And I want you to think about that in your own life. Are you majoring in the minors, as they say? And then the third principle or thought I had is, we're all going to die anyway. There's no point in making it. There's no point in hurrying that on if we can still do some good for ourselves and those around us. I think that was something that Sartorius had to deal with in that 7-day monk mode session he had after his mom died, and he got that invitation from the Lusitanians, and even before that. I want you to think about this. When he was at the very last point in his life and doing all the stuff he was doing in Spain, he had two armies, not just one. They sent another one, who was generaled by this guy named Pompey. And most of every engagement he had with both of these armies, he won. And it got so bad for the Roman Empire at that point because of what he was doing in Spain and what Spartacus was doing in Italy and what Mithridates was doing in Pontus, that Pompey himself had to send a nasty letter over to Rome, basically threatening them with his army if they refused to give him supplies and reinforcements. And it got to the point that leading citizens of Rome had to actually dip into their own pockets to finally get Pompey what he needed so he could maintain the campaign against Sertorius. We know Quintus Sertorius' name today, not just because he was a great general, not because he was quick in thinking or violent in action, but he understood a core principle that I think applies to all of us. So I want to caveat that with, that doesn't always mean you're going to win at all the battles that you've chosen to engage in. Sertorius, for example, did not win, ultimately. A number of years later, he was assassinated by, you guessed it, another allied Roman. Don't worry, that Roman decided to take over Sertorius' army and then promptly got crushed and taken care of by Pompey. In all of this, I don't want to paint Sertorius as some sort of paragon of virtue. He, for all of his good characteristics, was still a brutal Roman. He murdered, he lied, he was a good propagandist. If you want to look up the propaganda campaign he utilized with a white fawn and lots of goddess worship, you can look that up on your own. But the point is, I don't want to paint it out as anything than what it is, but I think he touched on a principle that applies to all of us. And with that, I think I will end this story. If there's enough people that want me to finish up the story of his life, the last number of years of his life, kind of the highlights and battles and whatever else that he kind of did during the last number of years of his life, I would be happy to do that, but you would have to let me know in the comments on whether or not that would be worth your time and mine. But I think this is a good spot to end this video, due to the fact that I think the principle is illustrated correctly at this point. Anyway, I encourage you to start plucking, taking one step or hair at a time at life, and take care of yourselves. Take care of those you care about. Do something today that makes the world a little bit of a better place because you were in it. And see you later.